So, hello everyone, welcome. This is a seminar on targeting the poorest, missing the mark. We are arranging the seminar today here at the Swedish Development Forum, together with ACT Church of Sweden. My name is Karin Klebe Blomqvist. I'm a member of the FUF board, and I also work at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. One of the revolutionary principles of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals was the principle of leaving no one behind, meaning that efforts to improve global health, create sustainable societies, combat environmental degradation, and much more should reach everyone, not just the privileged. It is commonly accepted that social protection systems is a means to do this. They can help both individuals and families, and in particular the poorest and most vulnerable, to cope with crises and shocks, find jobs, and invest in health and education for their children. According to the World Bank, social protection systems that are well designed and well implemented can powerfully shape countries, enhance human capital, productivity, reduce inequalities, build resilience, and end intergenerational cycles of poverty. There are two central design principles of social protection systems: targeted systems trying to reach a specific group, and universal systems trying to encompass everyone in a population. A prime example of a universal system would be the Swedish child protection or the Swedish child care system, where each family gets money per child regardless of income. Yes. Globally, we see a move towards more and more utilization of targeted social protection systems and policies. In several affluent countries, this development has taken place in parallel with increases in poverty and income inequality. There's clearly a need for scientific research on this subject, and Stephen Kidd, who's with us here today, has done some of that. He recently published a report, this one here, Targeting the Poorest, Missing the Mark. Is called Hit and Miss, an assessment of targeting effectiveness and social protection. And the aim of the research outlined in the report is to test the relative effectiveness of different approaches to targeting specific portions of the population and social protection schemes. And before I let Stephen tell you about the results, I will also present our panel. Professor Kenneth Nilsson works at Stockholm University at the Swedish Institute for Social Research. And Sara Heikkinen-Breiholtz is a member of the Social Democratic Party, sits in the Swedish Parliament, and also is a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. But now, without further ado, I will leave the stage to Stephen.
Right. Thanks very much. The microphone's working? Yeah? Okay. Great. So, yeah, it's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation to come over and speak. So, yeah, we're very grateful to ACT Sweden for the support that they gave in helping us do this research. Of course, there's a massive debate. If you work in low middle income countries, working on social protection, this is a very, very big debate. I've been working on it for over 15 years, as I've been very much involved in it. And the idea of this report was this research was to really see how effective are different types of target. Is poverty targeting working? We knew it wasn't, but we thought, let's get the evidence. And so what we did, we worked got national household survey data sets from over 20 countries and over 30 programs, and looked at who was receiving the benefits across the welfare distribution to look at the accuracy of these programs. So, you know, I'll go through some of the results of the report, but also try to set it in a little bit of a broader context, because there's much more to this whole debate than is actually in the reports. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I also think it's interesting to remember when we start off, you know, about the sort of SDGs and about reaching the poorest. It's about reaching the poorest. It's not about targeting the poorest. Reaching the poorest is an objective. Targeting the poorest is one methodology, right? It's very different, and they're often confused. Okay, so that's what we need to remember. So, first, I want to just mention, language influences how we view the world and how we think about the world. We often talk in very binary positions about the poor and the non-poor, as if there were a group called the poor at the bottom of the income distribution, and it's fixed, and we can just give all our programs to that. But a fixed group of the poor is a fictional construct, right? And a fictional construct is not a good basis for social policy, right? So just to very quickly to sort of just explain what I mean, if you were to look actually around the world at different countries, and this is just a selection of 5 countries, on how much are people actually living on in terms of their daily per capita consumption, it's very, very little in most, right? So while we think of the poor down at the bottom here, in fact, if you were to look, say, in a country like Bangladesh, almost 85% of the population are living on less than $5.50, right? This is the top of the green. In purchasing power parity terms. In real terms, that's $2.23, right? Very little. Get an idea of what that means for people? It means that if you were living in Sweden, the standard of living you would get if your income, if your consumption was 50 kronas a day. That's not very much. That's about, what, $5? That's the equivalent of $5.50. And that's the standard of living that you would get. That's how we understand purchasing power parity terms, right? So you'd be starving pretty much in Sweden. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about here. And so we can see in most countries, people are living on very, very little. So even in Uganda, we've got on less than $1.09, which is $3.20 in purchasing power parity terms, we have about 70% of the population. So people are living on very little. This idea that there's a group of the poor at the bottom is farcical to a degree. Everybody in most low and middle income countries is living in poverty, and everybody requires most of them social protection. Even more, if you look at how things change over time, over very, very short periods of time, you can see that there's a lot of dynamism in this. There is no fixed group. So this is just looking at a couple of countries, Uganda and Indonesia. We've done this analysis in lots of countries with panel survey data. You go back to the same household year after year or every couple of years. You can see, just take, for example, in Indonesia, this is children in Indonesia, looking at the poorest 20% in 2014, next poorest up to the richest 20%, and then just 1 year later, see where they're ranked. And we can see there's already very large differences in just 1 year, because people are subject to shocks, crises, you know, they lose their jobs, they get ill, etc., etc. Their animals die. And so this is changing all the time. So the idea there's a fixed group of the poor is a fictional construct. Okay, and that's why targeting the poor, even if we could do, is incredibly difficult to do, because things are changing all the time. And in reality, there's not that much difference in the incomes of households in the bottom 80%. Really, it's really the top 5% where we see big differences amongst them. Also, I think we have to remember it's a very much an ideological. The views on social protection are very ideological. They're deeply embedded in terms of ideology. And one, you know, that we've evolved different systems around the world. One we could classify as a sort of citizenship system, where you get programs on the basis of being a citizen of a country. It's a basic human right, a right linked to the right to social security in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's about countries then being willing to have more redistribution, a larger state, higher taxes, and redistribute to everybody. And when we redistribute to everybody in universal programs, the poorest tend to be the main beneficiaries, because they're accessing higher quality programs. The charity approach is very much the approach that was used in the 19th century in England with the poor laws, poor relief. We give programs to the poor. It's not a right. It's just given to the poor. We have these programs targeted to the poorest. They're linked very much to small state, small taxes. So low taxes, so those on the right of the political spectrum tend to support poverty-targeted schemes because of the low taxes, and ultimately the rich are the main beneficiaries of those programs, not the poorest when you're targeting the poor, because the rich are paying much lower taxes, while they're giving very meager benefits to the poorest. So this is the kind of debate. And so we're looking at which of these are most effective, because what we tend to do in development is follow often the charity model, whereas countries often, democratic countries, trying to move towards this more citizenship model. So we're going to look at this sort of effectiveness of the different approaches. But I just wanted, we can discuss the ideology behind it, but let's just remember targeting the poor is generally a right-wing ideology, right? Universal programs tend to be much more from the center to the left. It's the kind of consensus in most of our in most of our countries. So how effective are poverty targeted programs then? So we looked at all these programs here. Some of them are quite well known if you're working in international development, all of these are programs that target less than the 25% of the specific category. So they're targeted the very poorest 25% or less, some down to about 2% of the population. What are the errors? We have different types of programs, proxy means tests, what I explained here, to community-based targeting means tests. And you can see the errors go from exclusion errors, that's what proportion of those who are meant to get the program actually get it, goes from excluding the best 44% of those who are meant to get it are excluded, up to 97% in Rwanda on a public works program. And we can see a lot of different programs all the way around there. So I don't know if people know the sort of Prospera program in Mexico Opportunity, that's linked there at about 54% errors. So so we're looking at very, very high errors overall. So we thought, let's try and present that more pictorially for each program to see the kind of distribution of these errors across. So this is the best targeted program that we found in low and middle income countries, Brazil's Bolsa Familia program. And on these graphs, how to read them is we'll rank the population from the poorest to the richest here. And then we see the red line shows the line of eligibility. This is everybody to the left of the red line is the target population. Everybody to the right is what you call the inclusion errors, okay? And sort of in Brazil, we see that we have this exclusion error of 44%, this kind of strange pattern in which the very poorest, there's less access, but it's an exclusion error of 44%, and then an inclusion error, mathematically you would get the same, is 44% there. So it's not going to the richest, should we say, in Brazil, but it's missing, which is our main concern, is the exclusion error. If we're reaching, not leaving anybody behind, it's missing 44% of the population. It's a means test in Brazil. You just declare your income and the state believes what you say. Okay, it's a very simple targeting methodology, but interestingly the most effective in terms that, I don't have time to go into why it's the most effective on that, but I can later if you wish. But in terms of target, there's a lot of debate being going on internationally about how to do it. The World Bank have then been promoting a particular methodology called a proxy means test methodology, which comes out of Latin America originally. And this proxy means test methodology is really a way of predicting household incomes. You try to predict it by looking at the assets that a household has. So use a household survey, you identify certain assets or proxies. So it might be the type of house, type of roof, type of floor, type of wall, whether you've got animals, whether you've got a refrigerator, whether you've got a television, etc. Educational level, size of family, anything that is correlated to poverty, and they run regressions and come up with the best sort of 20 or 30 things. In some countries actually they go crazy and they go like to 200. Which must make an incredibly long survey that they have to do. But you're above 20, you don't get much improvement in your in the effectiveness. And you go out, when you've got that, you go out and you do a survey on households, and then you ask them about all these questions. Do you have a television? Do you not have a television? Etc. etc. Whatever their answers are, you put it into an algorithm. It comes out with the magic results, ranks everybody from poorest to richest in the country. And if you do it well, you go to every household in the country, as they've done in Pakistan, for example. That's the proxy means test. So it's about a prediction, okay? So, and this is used right across the world now, being pushed really, really hard across Africa and Asia. So the results are like this, the proxy means test. They're not great. One of the better ones is the Philippines Pantawid program, which has an exclusion error of 48%. It's about half of the target children are missing out of the program. Mexico's Prospera program is 54%, and then we get down to Indonesia, which has spent a fortune on this. The last survey they did cost $100 million, to go and do the survey. This was the result they got. A little bit better than random selection, but not much. So on the PKH program and conditional cash transfer, it's 82% of children are excluded. And in Pakistan, which is an example where the World Bank are particularly fond of promoting and say that this is a very good example. In Pakistan, we find exclusion error of 73%. In fact, as we understand, when MPs were doing the selection in Pakistan over 10 years ago, they were more effective than the proxy means test in terms of their selection of, of beneficiaries. And that was a joke in the World Bank when they'd done the analysis about 10 years ago. But they still moved on with the proxy means. So that cost $60 million to do, and they haven't retargeted for 10 years because it's too expensive to do. So they're still targeting on data they collected 10 years ago. And you imagine, so any child 0 to 10 does not exist in the database, but we're still targeting well, they're not targeting. They're not, everybody's been on the program for 10 years. Problem with the proxy means test, it's just really, really inaccurate. It's kind of, this is sort of showing the design errors in the proxy means test. So this is an example of design errors in, I think, it was Uganda, I think. They all look pretty much the same if you do it in any country. What we're doing here is each household in the household survey is a blue dot. And we sort of rank in here the predicted consumption by the proxy means test from poorest to richest of the households here, and the actual consumption found in the household survey. Okay, so if it was perfectly targeted, if it worked well, all of this would be, what do you think, one blue line, okay, from there all the way through to there. But it kind of like scatter, like we're throwing the money out of the window. So just to get a sense that, say along here, this household here is, or this household here, pretty much the poorest households in Uganda, but they're predicted by the proxy means test to be just about the richest, in the top 10% or so, 20%. Okay, so it's really, really inaccurate. And again, here we have one of the wealthiest households in the country, predicted by the proxy means test to be one of the poorest. So we have this kind of broad scatter, and so this group are the only correctly included. These are all your exclusion errors, and these are all your inclusion errors. And this is just the design. This is before you go out to actually implement the program, so you're starting from a very low base. And the R squared, so that is how accurate the targeting is into the correlation. If it was 1, it would be perfect accuracy. 0 would be no accuracy. The R squared is generally about 0.4 to 0.6. This is about 0.6, so it's a very good example of a very accurate proxy means test. Not that accurate overall. If we were to look at Africa, you know, so there's where a lot of Swedish funding is going into Africa. How well is the targeting doing in Africa? Here we can see Ghana, the LEAP program, very well known, but it only reaches 2% of households, so it's hardly reaching anybody, but there's almost nobody in the poorest 2%. But it's a very famous program, as if it was making major change in Ghana. It's almost irrelevant. Ethiopia, the Productive Safety Net program, absolutely 100% funded by international donors, got massive international support, pretty much random selection with an exclusion area of 81%. This is the DFID funded program. The Hunger Safety Net program in northern Kenya uses a mix of community-based targeting and a proxy means test. And it's, apart from this little group here, it's pretty much random selection. In there. This was a very expensive one to do. It cost $10 million to target around only 400,000 households. If you did that the whole of Kenya, it would cost you about $350 million to replicate this methodology, but we got random selection from that. And then Rwanda, 95% exclusion error. So, you know, people say, well, you know, you're fixing the results, whatever. Well, we didn't fix the results. Anybody can replicate this. But, you know, this is an example, a different way of presenting the results in Tanzania. This is a program supported by Sweden, SIDA, in terms of its targeting. You know, the TASAF PSSN program, I think it's in Tanzania. And here we can see a different way of presenting the results is to look at the proportion of the population against the welfare level of the beneficiaries of the program. And the red distribution is of the beneficiaries. The blue distribution is of the non-beneficiaries, and you can see it's pretty much a nice overlap. There's almost no difference between the beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. So that's what CEDA is achieving in Tanzania, pretty much random selection. $12 a household, replicate, that's the cost. Replicate that across Tanzania. For the whole of Tanzania, that's $120 million. If you want to do it every year, it's $120 million a year, then maybe a better use of that money than getting random selection, okay, where we could just get people to draw lots in the community. There are, interestingly, examples where you move to higher coverage, but you still use targeting. So South Africa's program, South Africa tries to exclude the well-off out of its programs. It's a sort of affluence test. So they recognize that most of the population in South Africa needs support. Most children need support. So use an affluence test, a very simple affluence test. Again, you just declare your income and the South African government believes you. They only test if you're a civil servant to check whether you've against the civil service database. So they're trying to get on this program about 70%. Well, they're actually trying to get about 80%, but 70% is the coverage. Exclusionary is 30%, so there's still some exclusion. Often it's for different reasons, because they don't have birth certificates, etc. Because you don't get rejected if you apply for this program. And like the proxy means test is just arbitrary selection. And then you have a sort of inclusion error of 13%, but we need to remember that some of that inclusion error is just about the movement. It's also about maids living in rich houses. They're sort of located here because they, under the household survey, they would then be regarded as being in a rich household, even though they're maids that may have a child. So, okay, so that's in part. So that's actually relatively successful, but on the basis that it's very high coverage. Okay, so we're doing it, but still get exclusion errors. Okay, which is of concern. So how effective are universal programs? Lots of countries are trying and are doing universal programs. How effective are they in reaching the poorest? Well, this is an example of some universal programs around the world. This is Mongolia's child money scheme, a universal child benefit, the only one really pure universal child benefit of the Swedish model in middle-income countries. And it had only 2% exclusion, mainly amongst the better off, who probably didn't apply for the program anyway, and amongst the poorest, pretty much 100% inclusion. So very, very effective in terms of doing it. This is a program, just saying earlier, that the World Bank and IMF have forced the Mongolian government to target by threatening to withdraw loans and not pay them loans. So they've been forced to target this program, which is now creating lots of exclusion including amongst poorer kids. Georgia's old age pension, universal, 1% of richer people generally are excluded from the program, probably because they're not applying either. So that's very, very effective. Bolivia has a couple of universal programs there, and you can see the sort of exclusion area is about 8%, so quite low. There is some exclusion, so obviously something needs to be done to address it. Could be issues around disability, etc., which are difficult for people to apply for the program, but again, much more effective in terms of reaching the poorest than any poverty-targeted program. So we want to reach the poorest. The evidence would suggest universal programs are much more effective. And if you were to put the results together, as we did here, and we sort of map the coverage of a program, so the higher coverage up to universal programs here, and more targeted programs are the ones down here, and then the exclusion error within the programs. As you can see, there's quite a nice correlation that obviously, as intuitively you would think, higher coverage universal programs have much lower errors, and the more targeted your program, the higher the errors that come. And then when you start targeting really down here at very small numbers, it pretty much is random. Okay, in terms of the errors are incredibly high, 70, 80, 90% or more. So it's just not working in terms of the effectiveness of the programs. Now, I guess the international debate is a lot. If we look at a population from childhood, working age and old age, one of the big debates is, whether we should just give blanket programs for the poor, sort of 19th century poor relief, that was as we had in England, or should we give programs across the life cycle? So what the World Bank is often promoting, and some of the donors, the Tanzania program that CEDA is supporting, is very much let's put poor relief in place. Tanzania, it's about working. It's a workfare program. You have to work, or you're obliged to send your kids to school, and if you don't, then you get sanctioned and by the program. So we can either have this kind of what the World Bank calls social safety nets, but they're not safety nets because you can't actually get on the programs except for once every 5 or 10 years. So the poor relief for everybody, the same sort of program, which doesn't work. Or do we start following the kind of systems that we have in our own countries, which are moving towards what is called now the social protection floor of benefits, universal benefits that cover different contingencies across the life cycle, from child benefits and disability benefits, old age pensions, unemployment benefits, which a number of countries are putting in place around the world. And they're much more effective, obviously, in terms of looking at the impacts. So this is the Philippines PAN-to-WID program. It costs only 0.4% of GDP, so it's low cost. And what you're looking at here is the poverty rate across each 5-year age group in the Philippines and poverty rate across each 5-year age group in South Africa. Okay, so the top is what the poverty rate would be without the program, and the grey line in both is what the poverty rate is after the program. So you can see the Philippines, it hardly makes any difference in terms of household consumption or household poverty. In South Africa, which has a much bigger system, spending 3.4% mainly on child benefits, disability benefits, old age pensions, not fully universal but very high coverage, you can see massive reductions in poverty as a result of that. And you find that with the universal programs tend to have very, very large reductions in poverty as well across the world, which is what you might expect if you were to look at sort of examples of child benefits. The Mongolia's universal child benefit costs more money, of course, universal 1.4% of GDP, but the increase in consumption of households from poorest to richest, it's got a much higher increase in consumption compared to the Philippines program, 0.4%, and Indonesia's 0.1% of GDP, which is hardly making any difference to the lives of the poor. But even amongst those are middle incomes who are still living in poverty, we're still making quite a difference just from a child benefit to the household. This is per capita increases in consumption, like 4%, which is not bad for that. Of course, the rich benefit more, but the rich are, of course, paying for the programs. So why shouldn't they also access the programs that gives them the support? There is, of course, lots of other harm and growing evidence about other harm that's caused by poverty-targeted programs. Just to give you a sense, the Philippines program that I've referred to a number of times, non-recipient children of that program, stunting rates have gone up by 11 percentage points. Okay, they've gone down for recipientship by 9%, but increased stunting by 11 percentage points. That's because there's a small increase in the cost of high-protein food, meat, eggs, fish, by 10%. So because the recipient kids, their parents are buying it. The non-recipient children, who are now the poorest in the communities, because it's pretty much, you know, the accuracy is about 54% exclusion error. They're now the poorest, can't afford the high protein foods, so they're now buying rice, which did not go up in price. So now they're feeding their kids rice. So we have this massive damage caused by that. It's the same model program that SEED is supporting in Tanzania is that, but we don't know whether these impacts are also happening in Tanzania. Ethiopia and a public works program, which was the model for the other branch of SEED's program in Tanzania. Ethiopia was the model. It's reduced per capita consumption of per person by $1.86 per month. So a household in general is about $10 poorer. And you could look at a lot of other issues and problems that we get increases in child labour. And one big problem is that community cohesion is fractured. Whereas the universal programs are very popular, communities come together, get behind them. These targeted programs divide communities because they can't tell why some people are getting it, why others aren't. It looks entirely arbitrary and random. And there's loads of studies that are showing how this generates conflicts and breaks down communities, which is one of their greatest assets, is now being weakened by these poverty-targeted programs. Another issue, of course, is who's missing out in the political ramifications of this. So basically, what the model that's being promoted is in many countries is there are in many countries still social insurance and civil service pensions for the well-off, civil servants and the formal sector. We're getting the poor relief programs for the very, very poor, but nobody's given any programs to those in the missing middle, right? They're not getting anything, despite the fact they're living on low incomes. That's politically really problematic, right? If we just look at who's out on the streets a couple of weeks ago in Chile, is the missing middle. These are not the poor. The poor are too poor to come out on the streets. It's those in the middle, the teacher, the makeup artist, the filmmaker. They're the ones on the streets because they're not getting the support because of these poverty targeted programs, and they're not accessing good quality programs to social insurance. This in Chile, one of the better off countries, right? It's an OECD country, and we shouldn't be getting that. The whole Arab Spring, which all the disasters that came out of that, was those are middle incomes coming out on the streets and protesting because they were being excluded by the poverty targeted programs. And the point about, which are more sustainable, which are going to get more funding, is the evidence is it's universal programs. They're much more sustainable, much more funding because they're more popular. Because poverty targeted programs, certainly in countries with democracies, they're just going to the poorest 20%. It's not a winning, no politician's going to get money behind that. CEDA can't get Tanzanian government to put any money into the program because it's going to them. There's no political reward for any government for programs for the poor. If you have programs like in South Africa, which are more building an alliance between those in middle incomes and the poor, then you're going to get much more political support. There's reward for politicians in elections. They can put forward these programs. Or a universal program has got the biggest alliance. And that's why universal programs get much, much higher budgets than any poverty targeted program. And governments themselves get behind these programs, whereas they don't like to get behind the poverty targeted programs. The universal programs also give higher transfer values. This is looking at old age pensions in democratic countries. Those in the Economist Democracy Index that score more than 5, so they're more democratic. You can see there's a trend that the higher the coverage of people over 60 of the old age pension system, the higher the benefit, right? Which is what you would expect, because the middle class are advocating for higher pensions. So those above 20% of GDP per capita, virtually all of them are essentially universal pensions. They have lower coverage, some of them, like in Kenya, because they're starting at age 70, not 60, but they're very popular. So they have much higher benefits, and you tend to get lower benefits amongst poverty targeted programs. I'll just quickly mention, so these poor relief programs, like the conditional cash transfers, looking at the percentage of GDP per capita, what are the value of transfers for the best pensions and disability benefits, child benefits around the world. Many of these are given to kids. You can see they're very low value transfers, very, very low. Even Brazil's famous Bolsa Família program, only 2% of GDP per capita. It's a tiny benefit, which is why it has virtually no impact in Brazil. So even the universal child benefits have much higher transfers because they're much more politically supported. I think it's also interesting to remember or to recognize that there are real political danger poverty targeted programs. So I don't know if you've heard of Mexico's Oportunidades program, was then called Prospera. It was abolished by a left-wing president early this year. It caused everybody, heartache. But it was a poor relief program for kids, mainly indigenous kids, with sanctions imposed against indigenous populations. It was abolished, and two new universal programs were introduced by the president: a universal pension and a universal disability benefit. Ultimately, it's about getting behind the type of nature of social protection system. Is about, are we designing social protection systems for the other, those who are different to us, the poor, the elderly, the disabled, those who are not us, and we design poor quality programs with poor quality targeting for the other, those who are different? Or do we, as we've recognized after the Second World War in Europe, we build programs for all of us? For we're all vulnerable at some point. Tomorrow, all of us could become disabled. We don't know. So we build much better disability benefit systems because they're going to benefit us as well. And good pension systems for all of us. So I'm just about getting to the end. I know you're going to get a bit nervous. And just one other thing on the poverty targeted programs. Interesting, they don't maintain their value often. The benefits go down. We see this, we just talked in the universal, on the child benefit program in the UK, since it was targeted, the transfer value has gone down. You can see this in Malawi's targeted, we we got Lesotho up twice, but this is Malawi's targeted program target, the poorest 10%, supported mainly by donors. The value of the transfer has gone down. Lesotho's universal old age pension over the years since they introduced, the value has gone up massively, 74%, often in each election, okay, because it's used as an electoral tool. So I think the kind of I'll just get on. I'll miss this out because of the time. Just one thing, people say, well, you can't afford universal benefits, etc. Well, of course, many countries are doing it. Kenya just put in place universal child benefit, which was much of that work we did, which was funded by Sweden. So that's one good thing you can say, although Sweden wasn't pushing it, but we got it. But, you know, the universal child, people say we can't afford universal child benefits. Well, you can if you take a longer term perspective, okay? If you were to start your universal child benefit at age 0 to 4 and put children on, and then don't take children off at all, you'll eventually reach 0 to 17, and you'll grow the program slowly over time. There's winners and losers, right? 5-year-old kids are missing out now if you put that, but you've got to make these choices. So we looked at that at a pretty good value of a child benefit with economic growth rates predicted by the IMF for the next 5 years, and looked at different countries. What would that cost? And we also looked at Indonesia, Pakistan, and Uganda, and looked at the costs. So in a program like, in a country like Indonesia, it would only start at 0.4% of GDP, which is pretty cheap. And by the end, you'd reach 0 to 17 and only 0.67% of GDP, well below what Mongolia's spending at the moment, not 1.4%. And Uganda, if we brought it in a bit slower, it's more expensive, but still by 2034, it's still only 1.4% of GDP, which it can easily afford. We've looked at the fiscal space for that. That's the same amount that Mongolia's spending. So in the end, I think what the big debate about is, do we want to build inclusive life cycle social security systems, helping all children, people with disabilities, older people, or do we want to target poor relief at the poorest? This is just simulations from Uganda, looking at what you would get. So on here, we're looking at simulated coverage of, if we reached everybody over 65, 80% of children, 90% of people with severe disabilities less than 65, at a cost of 2% of GDP. Now, it could be afforded. We get really high coverage, especially amongst the poorest. But if we target the poorest with a, what is a reasonable cost, 0.4% of GDP in Uganda with a proxy means test, just the design errors, we miss most of the poorest. So it costs more, but it's way more effective. It's much better at not leaving anybody behind. So ultimately, just end the choices in terms of the debate. Do we want, and I should have changed this to a Volvo, sorry. Do we want, a Rolls-Royce social protection system? Costs money, but it's great, gets you there. It's got really good benefits. Or do we want our second-hand Lada kind of social protection system, which is what has been promoted by development partners across the world and put in place in many countries, which don't really work and have very terrible targeted mechanisms, sanctions, etc., workfare that's alongside. It's the choice, and if we can't afford the Rolls, then we can try the Toyota model, which would be a bit cheaper, but still pretty good. Okay, so I'll just finish there, and I think we're going to hand over straight away. Yeah, great.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And now the panel can come on stage. Welcome, everyone. And Stephen, you can stay up here as well. Let's see if we can.
So you'll need this.
Yeah. Shut the projector off.
All right.
Yeah, it's getting in our eyes.
Otherwise, you have it in your eyes.
All right, starting with you, Kenneth.
Me?
Yeah, you have a background in social policy analysis. What are your thoughts on the results?
Is this on, this mic, or do I need to push a button?
No, it's on.
Okay, excellent. First of all, I would like to thanks for the invitation to be here on the panel, and thanks for an excellent presentation. And I also would say, from an academic perspective, a very good report. There are two ways for an academic to comment on this report. One way is to go to the technical details. The other one is basically to take it from what we know in terms of social policy and poverty and inequalities in the rich countries. and do some reflections. I will mostly go for the latter strategy, and the reason is that I think from an academic point of view, to make a judgment whether, can we believe in these results or not, you need to have much more information on the surveys and how you conducted the statistical analysis. I know from typically when you do this kind of analysis on the rich countries, what you do is that you work on one program in one country, doing one survey, and then you write like 30 pages on that. 15 of those pages are a statistical appendix. So my biggest worry in terms of the statistical analysis is whether there is some kind of mismatch between the group that you are able to target using the surveys and the actual target group of the policies in place. I know that when we do this, typically, sometimes we do this on social assistance in the rich countries, and then there is usually a mismatch. You can't really project it 100%. So of course that would be interesting to know. But otherwise, I think it's a incredible piece of work to work on all these surveys and bring all these statistics to the public. I think it's great. From the perspective of what we know from doing this research on the rich countries, I would say that basically what you do is that you show a general problem with these sort of targeted policies. That we have seen these on the rich countries for decades, that there is quite a lot of non-take-up, also on modern forms of social assistance that we have in Europe at the moment. There was a report, a government report in Sweden a couple of years ago, where they looked at the low-income targeted housing allowance for elderly people in Sweden. It has a non-take-up of 30%. Usually when we do analysis on social assistance, which is basically the means tested benefit in the rich welfare states, we usually find a non-take-up between 60 and 80%, depending on the design of the program and stuff like that. So we know that these policies, they don't reach the poor population, and we know that. Still, we recommend these programs for the developing countries, which I find is quite strange, and I find it incredibly strange that Swedish agencies like SIDA promote these programs, because in Sweden in 1948 we gave up on targeting social protection to the poor. We gave it up. We thought that, okay, this doesn't work. And since then, we have again and again and again shown that it doesn't work for the rich countries. But for some reason, we think that, but maybe it works in the developing countries. So I'm just a bit puzzled why we force the middle income and the low income countries we basically force them into a certain path in the development of social protection that we know doesn't work in the long run. And I think that's quite disappointing, honestly. But there's when I read the report, there are also some things that are missing. But of course, I know why it's missing, because you've already done a tremendous amount of work to get this report out. But what I think what I want to have more information on is why there is such a low non-take-up. Or what you call the exclusion error. I know from when we do this on social assistance in rich countries, we basically try to, because the non-take-up among the poor may be due to a lot of different reasons. It may be due to that the programs are so complex, so people don't really know about them. It could be fraud, it could be corruption, it could be just bad implementation. And so forth. So it would be interesting to somehow say a little bit more about, okay, what is the actual problem with some of these programs? But of course, you know, to fix it is quite a tremendous task. We not only need to define where the problem is, we also need to fix that problem. And obviously the easiest solution is just to abolish it altogether and go for a universal strategy. Of course, that would be much more costly, but we don't feed corruption, or we don't risk to feed corruption to the same extent, I would say. There are less, we reduce administrative costs, and particularly in the long run, we may increase social trust, even political trust in these countries, which I think it's very difficult to put a price tag on that. Let's see. Yeah, I would like to mention a last point, which I find is interesting. During the global financial crisis, I received an email from a few colleagues at the European Commission, and they were basically sending this email to confidentially to a number of social policy scholars around Europe, because they got a letter from the IMF and the World Bank, basically saying that, well, we want to push for a reformed social agenda in Greece. Basically, we want them to abolish all social policies and go for just one anti-poverty program, means-tested social assistance program. And all the scholars in Europe said that no, don't do that. That would be a disaster, not only, you know, right now, but also for the long-term future. So the Commission were quite, in this particular case, they were quite hard against the World Bank and IMF, saying that, well, you know, we can't do that. But this is, of course, a European country. But from, I think that also puts some perspective and raise a big question mark why Sweden is choosing this track for social policies in the global south.
I think that felt like a very good bridge to Sara.
Yeah, I wanted to hand over.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Very easy question.
Sara Häkkinen-Weholtz, you are a member of the Social Democratic Party, which is one of the government parties right now, so in charge of international development cooperation policy.
Yes, I am. And I myself asked that question, seeing how we know that the universal coverage is the key. People were leaving Sweden because they were starving not that long ago, and we virtually, I can actually say we, meaning my party and the Social Democratic Party, transformed this country with the universal pensions and universal child benefits. So why we are doing that, I don't have an answer. I would have to put that question to Sida, to Karin, and I will. I've actually thought about this a lot, and I've read the report, which it raised a lot of question marks for me as a politician, a Swedish politician, and I would only have to think that it's the old way of doing things. And the IMF and the World Bank, they are huge players. They have all the money. But the question that I was given for this was actually, what can I as a politician take away from this report? And I think that's what I like to focus on, not so much as why we have been doing things the way we have, because we didn't know any better. I would say that's the way we have done it before, but we can change that. And I think that we will have to work and strive towards that change. And that's what I would like to do. That we obviously can't go in blindly and just say, oh, this report is written by God and everything will change if I change the system. But we have to work towards that change in the system, because even though things cost more money, because that is one of the main reasons, I believe, for why we have been doing it the charitable way before across the globe, is because it costs less now. And we all know that funding is limited. We need money for all sorts of things. And so the easy answer and the kind of easy way for me to, or the way I would go if I were trying to hide, is that, well, we're trying to target poverty by ending starvation today, so we're trying to do it this way because that's what we believed. Only we need to then gain more money. We need to raise more funds in order to get the poorest into the middle income section so they can start paying taxes. Because I actually had this debate or discussion in Kenya, as it happens, in Nairobi last week with a representative from the Swedish Left Party, and then we were quite a few from all sorts of different parties across the board in Europe. And there's one Kenyan woman that worked with UNAIDS. We were going to a youth health center. We put the question to her of all these street vendors, because she was saying, the Left Party girl was saying, oh, but you know, they don't pay taxes, so there's no mean for the government to raise the funds, and you know, so they can't put it back into the community. And this Kenyan girl was saying, well, actually, that's not true. Because for the street vendor to be there, they pay the council. So even though that is the black market, as it were, because the street vendor selling the drink to you doesn't pay sales tax, but they pay for something else. So I think that we need to equip people with more capacity to build their own lives in a broad spectrum and a broad scale. And I don't know that this has been common knowledge for all that long. I'd like to at least believe that this hasn't been common knowledge among all policymakers in the world for the past 5, 10, 20 years. Because then you're just basically telling us that this is a whole big rigged corrupt system and someone's just pocketing all the money here. And I'd like to believe that it's not. So for me, I'm going to start asking the questions within my party. That's what I can do in order to change things. And I believe that it is possible. Then again, this is only focusing on the one economic spectra of what poverty is and what poverty means. And we all in Sweden see that measures poverty by other means. By disability, we know that that's one factor. By conflict, by gender and other types of exclusion, equality. So, I mean, there are so many different aspects of this which we need to look at. But I can only say that I will try my hardest to gain more knowledge, because it starts with that. Information is key, so I can spread this and try and inform my colleagues about these, because no one wants to pay for something that doesn't exist, because that's what we are doing if you keep missing the mark.
Thank you so much. So, Stephen, you actually work with informing policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah saying, I really hope that politicians haven't been aware that targeted systems aren't working. Kenneth is kind of insinuating that we already know the universal systems is the best way to go. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've known this in international development for a long, long time. I used to head DFID's, the UK's social protection team. We got on the agenda. We knew that the poverty targeted programs were failing. So when I was there, we were trying to push the UK to support more universal programs. We had a little bit of success, but not so much success. You know, but we've known about this for a long, long time. Everybody, so it's been a massive debate that's ongoing, but the resources that are being given often by bilateral donors to the World Bank, who will now have hundreds of people working on social protection, few of which understand anything about it because they've had no training. They're just economists with very simplistic views of the world and just following like sheep, you know, whatever they're told. They are going out and preaching conditional cash transfers, proxy means tests, randomized controlled trials, or workfare programs in every country. You can see every country the World Bank goes to, it's exactly the same recipe. They do the analysis and they come up with exactly the same type of programs, and they're all this type. So we've known that for a long, long time. The problem...
Can I just, sorry. So you're basically saying that for ages, we have known that these specific programs that we are donating our money to are completely failing. That's, to me, as a politician, that's, as a human being, as a lawyer, as I am, that's mind-boggling. Yeah. Here's 100 million of my cash. Use this for something that doesn't work.
Yeah, and so you've got big loans in the Philippines supporting programs that are increasing stunting amongst children. Donors, the UK, the European Union, the World Bank, USAID are funding the Ethiopia Productive Safety Net program that has been making families poorer. And we have an independent study by the Young Lives Project that's doing not only that, it's getting kids, increasing child labour, etc. So we've known this, but it's not taken, and you know, and it's very difficult to get, even in the World Bank, you know, the governor, sort of, you know, the board level, to engage and sort of challenge countries, challenging, why are you doing this? But it's being promoted, and just to give one example, I mean, in Tanzania, where Sweden is supporting that, I mean, Tanzania, a lot of people in Tanzania, a lot of the government, they've been wanting to put in place a universal pension. Zanzibar put it in place a couple of years ago itself. It's been trying to do, DFID tried to support them years ago. The World Bank came in, and with the Ministry of Finances about 8 years ago, told them not to take DFID support, to take the loan for the World Bank, to take the World Bank's loan, to then promote the workfare and conditional poverty targeted programs. They did that. DFID walked away, and then Sweden came in and supported the World Bank on that program. Nobody's questioning that, and it's, you know, it's a random you know, choice. The answer you'll get.
I think since we don't have anyone on the panel that's actually working specifically for SIDA, it's hard to assess how they've taken certain situations. But I could see that Kenneth wanted to add to the discussion.
Yeah, but I also social policy, social protection is to some extent about politics, and politics is to some extent of what the people believe in. Okay. So and unfortunately, I think the way politics are today, also in Sweden, but in many European countries, it's quite short-sighted. So you need to win the next election. So if you're going to invest a few dollars of Swedish krona somewhere, you better invest it so we can measure it tomorrow. because I don't win an election by measuring it 10 years from now. And I think that's a problem. So because I think that you know, investing money in universal policies, the big, you know, the big take home pay from that is not tomorrow. It's long time in the future, and unfortunately that I don't think that sort of harmonizes with the way politics typically is done nowadays, including in Sweden. But from a, you know, if I try to put myself as a policymaker, a politician, I can also think that it's probably difficult, honestly, for the Swedish people to tell the Swedish people why we should not invest our development aid money on the poorest people. Why we actually should invest that money also, for example, on the middle class or whatever. You know, it's a tough thing to sell into the people, but I think we need to do much better there. And so we need not only to inform the policymakers, not only inform the politicians, because if they can't do it because they will be voted out of office, because the public doesn't agree, you know, we're in a quite a bad situation. So I think we need to. Can I
just add to that, though? Yeah, over time, I agree with that analysis to a certain extent. Obviously, I totally agree with the part where we have to inform the public because we need to have facts. But it is difficult because we have a discussion about development and the 1% goal again. And it's got to do with, do we want to spend money out with Sweden or not? I mean, we have a broad agreement still among the public that we should help people that are less fortunate. But people want to know why and how. And I think that you can explain using the Swedish the child benefit, the universal child benefit, as an example, a good way of illustrating the broad and the, but I still think that a big part of this is understanding that it is cost effective, because that's the problem. I think with the people have this image of the universal systems of being too expensive and they're not cost effective. That's what people think. But we have the facts that says that it's completely opposite. But we need to educate people about that. That we need to get everybody, and leaving no one behind means also making sure that the middle class in a country where the middle class is also poor, because let's not forget that, is actually helping everyone in a cost-effective way. So there are so many parts to this that makes it difficult and challenging, I think. But I think that the key is education, key is information, and above all, we need to have the accurate facts and accurate information on the table, not like Trump's administration that do nothing but lie essentially all day, every day. But people still believe that.
Well, coming from a country where our Prime Minister tends to lie every day, then we can we can understand those those issues. Although we probably have them for another 5 years, which will be a disaster. But anyway, that's another thing. But I think that I think the question, going back, I think a couple of things I want to say to your question. What would CEDA say? Well, CEDA will say, well, of course we follow government's priorities, right? But that's, you've got to then unpick that. Really? Are you really following those government's priorities? Or who's talking to you in government? Even because we know in these countries, a lot of people in governments want more universal program. Yeah. We know that in Tanzania. So why are you not, unpicking that? In Uganda, there was a lot of work done with CEDA. People were talking, say, no, get behind the current proposals for universal programs. And CEDA's gone off and supported a parallel system, giving its money to WFP and UNICEF to fund different programs rather than the ones that actually the UK's been working on and Ireland's been working on for many years to get universal programs embedded within Uganda. So it wasn't following the government's priorities, because I know the government's priorities. I've been working with them for years there, and CEDA did not listen to what others were asking them there. The other question, I think, is the more worrying question for me is, are we undermining the social contract and democracy? Yeah. That's my big worry is, and that's what we're doing, because who are governments in Africa accountable to? Now, if you're putting in place a social security program, you should be accountable to citizens. Yeah. Obviously, right? Obviously, any politician should agree that. But who are you accountable to? If you've got a World Bank loan or a grant from the UK or a grant from Sweden, you are accountable to the World Bank or to Sweden or to the UK, because they're demanding, the use. And you're denying the governments the kind of programs that win you elections, which are the universal programs, which is why no African government is getting behind poverty-targeted programs. They're not investing in them. They're only investing when they get it into universal programs. That's why you can't they're not sustainable. They don't want to put the money into them. So while people say, well, they're cheaper, actually governments are willing to spend more because they're going to get the electoral reward from that, as any politician would understand. And that's what you want. That's how social protection grew, a social democratic consensus that spread across social democratic politicians, winning election after election, putting in place progressive programs. That's we are stopping happening in Africa and Asia and Latin America from many of the policies that we are following, because we're forcing them to have the only choice is a targeted program at the poor that they do not want to invest in. And they're not allowed often to put in place these universal programs. And if they do, they get attacked. And there are multiple stories of that happening, well documented stories which you can see from many sort of World Bank publications, etc., of them attacking these universal programs. undermining democracy and undermining the social contract, which is the biggest loss.
Absolutely, it is the biggest loss, and the threat to democracy is immediate, and we need to work on that. I, as I said, unfortunately have not been in government, so I can't answer why have we made the priorities that we have been making for decades. It's especially on the contrary to research and science, which I like to base all my decisions on, and I like to think that I make informed decisions, and I try to at least. This I absolutely will continue working on, as I believe in the SDGs. I believe in leaving no one behind, and I find it so hard to accept that Sweden would and the Swedish government knowingly. I hear what you're saying. I believe in the studies. I'm not saying that, but I find it hard to accept as a social democrat who believes in these values. I find it hard to accept that we would go where, if there are two alternative routes, and there is one where you have the universal social protection and you help people, and the UK was behind that, and then you have this other route that is targeting and hit and miss essentially up to over 90%. I don't understand that, and I find it very hard to accept. And I'm not saying that is not true. I'm just saying that for me it's hard to accept, and I can't just leave that out there knowing that, and just we then have to work harder. Yeah.
Well, I can't comment on CEDA, right? But I worked in DFID for years leading this. The problem was every individual advisor in the countries and DFID was doing their own thing, and we couldn't control them.
Of course.
And so if they wanted a poverty target program, they did it. We couldn't control them from the centre, and we didn't get the support from senior management and the politicians to get a sort of consistent thing. So DFID was doing random, completely different policies in different countries, and you can't control the individuals who often we knew didn't understand. Our staff didn't understand what they were doing and were promoting these programs, and this is a problem in the development agency. You may have at the top a great idea, but what's happening? Down, and the idea, what you should be doing is say, okay, let's evaluate this. Let's bring in some independence, and let's look at our program, and let's get an independent assessment of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and if it's good or bad. Mm-hmm. Because I think ultimately, I can understand that the UK now, we get behind neoliberal targeted programs, etc. That's our government, right? I can understand the United States and the World Bank doing that. What we do expect is that the Nordics stand up for the kind of progressive social policies and social protection policies, around the world in international development. Because if the Nordics aren't going to stand up for it, who is? Right? And who's challenging that? Because nobody else is going to do it. And that's what I find the most worrying. Finland's got a better record. There's a couple of individuals in.
I think. But Kenneth wants to join the discussion for a bit.
I just want to say that there are a bunch of studies out there who basically claim that some of the programs that you have, on the screen here, are actually successful. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine for policymakers and politicians who are not trained in this, have not done 15 years of research, it can be quite difficult to digest all the results and make up your opinion. And we need to take that on board. But I think what is interesting, to go back to this particular report, is that you have some more of a universal programs in there as well. Because what I'm from as a researcher, what I usually miss in these evaluations on these conditional cash transfers, particularly, is that they look at a single program. But to me, social policy is always about choosing between different paths. And then it matters, okay, so what is the alternative? Is there another way to do this that brings about even more fundamental change in a promising direction. And I think that is what is typically missing in this literature, the way I have read it.
Yeah.
And I think that this report is actually good in that respect, that it actually includes different types of programs. So we can look at them side by side. On this dimension, these programs do not score good.
Yeah.
But it's important, I think, in a seminar like this to actually say that there are a bunch of studies.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
on showing
And the you know on sorry, I've got the microphone here. on these, you know, the studies, right? I mean, there's no doubt on many of these programs, you give cash to a family, makes a big difference to them.
Yeah.
Of course.
What we're not seeing is all the other families are missing out, all the other problems in the community, the divisions that have been caused, the problems that we see in the Philippines, because these studies are not looking at that. They're looking, and they're kind of propaganda studies. And so the Mexico Oportunidades or Prospera program was the biggest one, right? That had massive evaluation money put into it, big dissemination to get it. And of course, it's killed off. Now it's dead, right? All of that money is dead, right? These people, the children, I mean, it's terrible in the sense that those families now are no longer getting support in Mexico. But if Mexico had actually moved to a universal child benefit, that program would never have been killed off. But it was you know, it wasn't able to do that. But a left-wing, you know, president, he's now got universal pensions and disability benefits, which is good, but, you know, now you need to move back. Let's get a universal child benefit in Mexico. But it is a sort of big propaganda machine that's out there, and people can't sort of see through and sort of question this and look much more broadly at, so what's happening to the losers? Because we're only looking at the winners in these events. We're not looking at the losers. And that's what we need to also look at if we're leaving no one behind. And disability is a big issue, you know.
Yes,
Kids with disabilities, they're not getting into these programs.
No,
Conditional cash transfers, they're not allowed in because lots of them aren't at schools. So you're actually keeping those out. There's a lot of harm being done, and we need to look much more beyond this and question it much more. But again, go back, learn from our own experiences what we did, and why don't we do the same thing?
And I come back to that whole, the money is limited. But then, because politics is about choosing. That is what politicians do. We have this amount of money and how we're going to spend it. So you prioritize. What is the most important thing right now to me as a politician? Is it to win the next campaign, or is it to make and bring about real change? And these are fundamental questions that one has to ask themselves. Because we have problems, even in Sweden, making the right choices. Because we have child poverty here. We also know how much it would cost to end it, I think. Yet, we haven't.
Yeah, but a poor child in Sweden, the problem is, would be a really rich child in Tanzania.
Absolutely.
And we're sort of,
I know, bring about that you have to make your priorities.
Yeah. But I think the question that there is no funding, we've done a lot of work. There's funding in these countries, and particularly economic growth. Many of these countries have got high economic growth. Yes. There'll be we've done lots of work. It's a political choice.
Yes,
it's not a choice. There is. I know.
That's what I said.
No, I'm agreeing with you. There is always the funding. This idea there's a fixed part, there's a limited funding. That's not true.
Yeah, and I wanted to come back on that, because I think that's a key issue, at least from a sociological perspective where I come from. Because the economists tend to look at it as, okay, we only have this money. This money is fixed. Of course, if I should spend that money, which I can't change, obviously I should make, I should spend it on the poor. But we know from doing this research on the rich countries for 5 decades at least, that the money is not fixed. The budget depends on how we design these policies in the first place. So if you design it in a way so the policies brings around a lot of public support,
and we can encourage the public to pay tax.
Yeah, and that's the key. But unfortunately, that I don't think that idea of political economy, we usually call it, is really picked up by economists.
No. And the latest World Bank white paper on social protection came out 2 or 3 months, was exactly like that. It was all a fixed budget idea. Therefore, it's much better to give it to the poorest because we have a fixed budget. We have a fixed budget. No, we don't. There's no country in the world that has a fixed budget, it's all a political choice. But they're locked into this very simplistic idea that, you know, they're all economists. They've all been brainwashed through the Chicago School, etc., of economics, you know, and they can't see that there's different, actually, paradigms of economics that, you know, nobody teaches Keynesian economics in universities now. None of them know about it, so they don't have the choices to apply. And it's incredible how simplistic the thinking is of some of these guys when you come up against them and you see them working on this fixed budget idea, and you say, no, it's all about the political economy, guys. It's all about the political economy.
It is, and it's about political will. But I have to agree with what you said earlier on then. It's about how does the society feel? Because I as a politician, of course, I am a leader, but I can only lead people that are with me. That's sort of what it's like. So we need to all work together in order to raise public opinion on these matters and sort of bring about social change, if you will. Abortion in Ireland is a perfect example of that, social change. It was illegal abortions in the constitution that was actually the people voted by a 2/3 majority to put the ban on abortion into the constitution in the 1970s. That same numbers today, 2/3 of a majority in 2018 voted for legal abortion in Ireland. That is not something that happens overnight. It's social change. And that's a political will and ambition, if you will. So we need to work together. We have to have the political ambition and political will, but we also have to have the people with us in society in order to change these things. Because if the pressure gets too big out there for these changes to happen, for these budgets to increase, then they will. But see, that's not what I hear. I hear of the decrease of these budgets, how people want to spend less money outside of Sweden when we have all these issues in Sweden, because you have to make the priority. What is more important, and how can I show and illustrate how much I gain from this? Well, maybe Sweden doesn't stand to directly gain something by this dollar spent today immediately. Maybe we need to accept that that's called solidarity, and we need that too.
Yeah, you don't need, Sweden doesn't need to spend very much at all on social security in low and middle income countries to make a massive difference. Just to give the example in Kenya, okay? So it was Swedish funding that we worked in Kenya. What happened was, in terms of how they got the universal pension, is that we fund, the WFP and UNICEF funded some training of politicians, which we gave for a day. 3 ministers turned up. Not many of the MPs turned up, but 3 ministers turned up. We got them to understand, you know, different paradigms of social protection, promoted it, and the cabinet minister then said, "Well, yeah, I'm now beginning to understand," because they had this targeted old age pension, very targeted. So I went to community and I said, I expected them all to be really, really happy to see me because we'd given them this pension for the poorest in Kenya. I said, everybody was angry. Everybody was angry. They were complaining that this person didn't get it, this person didn't get it, that person got it, and they're better off, and all of this. So they were all angry with me. Yeah. So I said to her, I said, okay, you're a politician. Why are you designing programs that make you unpopular as a politician? What kind of politician are you? I said, why aren't you doing a popular program like make it universal? And she said, oh yeah.
I can do that.
I can do that. So then they went off, and they talked to the Minister of Finance.
Yeah.
And I prepared some papers for them. This was outside, and showed them, and election was coming up in Kenya, and they got us a meeting. I said, look, you can win the election on this, right? And we got a meeting with the Minister of Finance around the table, brought us in for an hour, and we said I explained to him all the benefits of this. One we haven't looked at is the real benefits for economic growth of this. That's massive benefits of economic growth, which is all we've got about. I said, look, you're going to win the election on this. This is going to win you that. This is a really popular program. And he got it. He announced it 2 months later in Parliament in the budget speech. preparing for the election. Everybody in Kenya said, no, you're never going to do this. This is just another lie from the politicians. They went out then and registered everybody over 70 in Kenya during the electoral campaign. Cabinet ministers went out to the registration centres. They used it for the campaign and they got elected. There was, of course, disasters in the election in Kenya after that, but that helped Kenyatta win the election. And then they implemented it. Now everybody in Kenya can get a pension over 70. And it was a very quick thing. And the total amount of CEDA funding that went into that, I imagine, was around $30,000. Okay.
Oh, I think Kenneth wants to.
I didn't mean that we don't have the money. I'm saying that people in Sweden or in like-minded countries, if you will, need to accept that maybe there won't be a dividend immediately for Sweden's taxpayers, because that is called solidarity, and maybe we need to show some solidarity, and we have to accept that that's a good thing for the world, because that's what development money is in a large part at the beginning, because you need to invest in other parts of the world in order for it all to work. And I think that we need to be honest and say that, because I get worried when I hear about, well, what about the dividends? Well, hang on a minute. The dividends maybe isn't economical. Maybe you shouldn't expect to get a 150 return on a dollar spent. And you just need to accept that, and you need to be honest. But that's difficult sometimes, putting it out there bluntly as a politician. I've noticed, because I am quite blunt and I call it the way I see it. And then a lot of people, they get sort of confused and perplexed. I went to Copenhagen and spoke to people at UNFPA. And they were like, oh, you're a nice change. You actually say stuff. Do you always talk like this? And I said, sorry, I don't know any other way. But that is, to me, what we need to do. And we need to be able to speak our minds, because I believe that most of my colleagues, and I can only talk for the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, obviously, we don't want to be spending money that isn't helping the poor. And if we can find a way where we don't necessarily lose the kids then that don't get the benefit because someone else gets it instead, where we can find ways that we can work with the World Bank and IMF, because sorry, we need them too. It's not like we can just say, oh, we don't need your money, we don't need your funding, because we do.
I love the idea that it would, we could get out and say to people that, come on, be a little bit more solidaristic and, we fix this. But my problem is that I don't believe in that idea. I think it's basically impossible. What we need to do when we implement social policies is basically to think in a way that we should include everyone. That's the only way. That's the only way. Then we have a built-in the interest in these kind of policies, and that's the way to do it, I think. And that's what history shows us when we look at the rich countries. And then people become solidaristic the way we measure it. But if we ask them, they probably are as selfish as they used to be. But they believe in the idea of the welfare state because they benefit from it.
But as Sweden to continue to be a giver, the Swedish population still need to be behind that.
Obviously, but that's obviously a much larger issue. But if we cut back on the welfare state that we have done in Sweden over the last 2.5 decades, of course that will also probably have an effect on the will of the people to invest money in foreign aid policies and stuff like that. So. Everything is connected, but it's not. But it's a good thing if we can make a change even with small amounts of money.
Governments themselves have got it. What we don't, we can need the World Bank, but we need a reformed World Bank and people who understand and who are intelligent, who are able to get progressive policies and not follow their own personal ideological beliefs in taking it forward. We need that. European Union puts a lot of money into social protection. Sweden needs to influence again in the European Union. So why is the European Union putting a whole lot of money into the productive safety net program in Ethiopia, which is making people poorer and making children work? Why is it doing that? So that's Swedish money. because you're part of the European Union. Of course, we won't have that problem in the UK in the near future. We can wash our hands of that problem as we move out of
Of the EU. Yeah, all right.
You think?
Yeah.
You think,
Those
but,
standard type of issues.
no, it's a tragedy to move out. Right? But the,
Yeah.
you know, so I think that, but I think this is, you know, getting back. Some countries have got to stand up for a more progressive,
Absolutely.
and really need to take this on. 12% of World Bank lending is on social protection in low-income countries. It's a massive amount of lending. Sweden could influence that lending for the good.
Yeah.
Imagine the change you could make in terms of the World Bank getting behind really good programs and stop attacking the universal.
I will take that issue with me to Washington for the spring meeting in the World Bank and IMF.
And I'll
promise.
give you lots of examples that you can quote to the World Bank and ask them why they're doing this and why they're saying
me,
this.
I will.
Yeah.
So clearly we have a panel that agrees in much on the need for focusing more on universal policies and international development cooperation. I want to open up the floor now to our audience. This Lut.
But surely we
So
can
sorry.
take a couple,
I wanted
maybe
to.
one. Okay.
Um,
Does anyone have a question? I think that if we could. No.
No.
We've talked far too much ourselves.
All right.
It's like,
It has been a very interesting and intense discussion. Thank you so much to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Kenneth and Sarah for coming here and commenting. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your very interesting presentation. And hopefully there will be more. This is super exciting research, and hopefully more people will be digging into this issue and seeing how universal policies can increase or make better livelihoods for everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.